Well, this morning we start a new series. How many of you are thankful that I'm not talking about money? Hey? So it's over. You survived. Some of your marriages barely, but you made it. Well, this morning we start a series called Keeping Up with the Joneses, a practical guide to chasing Jesus instead of everyone else. Because the reality is that we live in a culture that is causing us to look around at everybody else. The Joneses are just a family like the Smiths or whatever name you want to put in place, a typical Canadian family that everybody just looks to and looks at and says, it seems like everything is perfect for them. It seems like life is perfect. And some of you on social media, you go on and you see that family, those people that as you're scrolling through and you see them and you think, look at that. And wow, look at that. And look what they're doing. And I wish we could do that. I wish we had a family that hung out like that. I wish we had a family. I wish we had a marriage like that. I wish I had a kid like that. I wish I had and we start comparing ourselves to others. We look to the left and we look to the right and we begin to kind of compare ourselves to everybody around us. And we begin to think that other people just seem to have something that we're missing, that they've got something happening that we don't have happening. And we kind of began to look at our family and we began to kind of encourage them along, and we began to kind of just, not because they, aren't good enough, just because we want them to reach their full potential, don't we? And it isn't about them really, though, is it? It's about us. It's about how we're feeling inside and the insecurities that we have, but we don't label it that. We don't say that because none of us would ever admit to being insecure. I mean, come on, we're adults and we're adulting, and surely we don't need to feel insecure. And yet, as we look around, there are those that are richer and skinnier and smarter and taller and prettier and happier and hipper and talenteder and holier and better worshipers and whatever you want to add in that you're just like, because we live in the land of don't we? We live where everybody has a little bit more than us. Or it seems that way. It seems like, in our financial series, we talked about the fact that we're richer than we think. Just as Scotiabank told us. We're far richer than we think. In fact, we said that globally speaking, you're in the top 1% of wage earners if you make $48,000 a year, and yet somehow we think everybody is richer than us. And so we began to kind of encourage our family. You began to encourage your spouse. If you could just, be a little bit more whatever that thing is. If you could, and we start to compare, and I see this with parents and grandparents, and they're not intending to do this, but on the school ground, especially, parents used to just kind of talk about, my little Johnny started reading at age 1. And not just picture books, I'm talking about novels. Sure. And the next parent is like, well, Gabriella, she read the entire Bible from cover to cover by the age of 4. And you just see parents beginning to compare themselves, and there's some one-upmanship, and we just want to have a little bit more And it's not about our family, it's about us. It's about how we feel inside. And then there's the other side of this, where there are those that are heavier and slower and shorter and poorer and nerdier and sadder. And I know nerdier for some of you today is a good word. But in our generation, that was still on the negative side, and so you can put it where you need to put it. But the reality is that we look to the right and we look to the left and we compare. And we feel stronger before some, and we feel weaker before others. We feel superior before some, and we feel lesser than others at times. And I remember distinctly on one occasion, Sparrow being at gymnastics. And in gymnastics, they point out how tall you are every time you go, because they make all the kids line up from shortest to tallest in the group. And Sparrow was always at the front because she was the shortest. And I thought this was great because it meant she got to hold the team sign, and I got to take a picture of her really well. Only I began to notice that Sparrow didn't feel that way about it. Sparrow actually became quite self-conscious that she was the shortest. And she began to kind of look to the side, and she would see all the other kids line up, and you would see her kind of get up on her tiptoes and just try and be taller than the next person beside her. And she just wasn't. And I could feel my heart sink. And over the weeks, every time we'd drop her off, she'd get in that line, and she'd be the shortest. Until one glorious week, when a new kid came in that was just a little bit shorter than her, who came and stood beside her, and she looked and she realized she was taller, and she stepped around her, and I could just see her chest well up with pride that she was no longer the shortest, and I was super happy as a dad. I know, pray for your pastor. But what I noticed was the dad beside me was the father of the little girl who now felt like she was the shortest. So pray for your pastor, because I was still happy my daughter was taller. Because finally, after all those weeks, she didn't have to feel that way. And we do that. We have this gross part of us, if we're truly honest, don't we? I mean, we all have it. And it isn't about our kids, if you have kids, or your dog, if you're a dog person, or your grandkids, or your spouse, or whatever it is, it's about us. Because we want to feel superior, which isn't even a word, I know that. But that's how we want to feel. We want to feel superior than everybody else. We want to feel better about ourselves. And so we compare. And we know that we shouldn't, but we do. And so we find ourselves in this place, in this land of where we struggle. And then there's those that are the richest and the skinniest and the smartest and the healthiest and the cutest. And they're just on a whole other level of their own. And, we look at one side, but then we look at the other side and we kind of go, wow. I mean, I want to, and they're not trying to be better than everybody else. They're just trying to reach their full potential. They're just trying to be the best them they can be. It isn't about being better than everybody else. That's not what they're thinking. But when you're standing here, you're thinking they're the richest because they're trying to be the richest. They're whatever because we're comparing. And we find ourselves constantly comparing. And what I've learned is that no matter how many times you look to the right or to the left, there's always going to be somebody on this side and somebody on this side. You never get to a place in life where all of a sudden you arrive and you're like, oh, good. Oh, good. I'm whatever it is, and I'm fine now. It seems as though we're constantly doing this. And I mentioned the school ground, but one of the places that I saw this the most is in the hockey rink. Is one parent says to another parent, hey, my kid's going to play rep hockey next year. The scouts have been here, and then the next parent is like, well, my kid's playing AAA next year. You should have seen when the scouts came out, they said that our child is just skipping 3 levels. And then the other parent comes along and says, well, you know what? That's awesome. Maybe the following year they could join my child at the age group up because they're playing a year up next year at AAA. And then the other parent says, well, my kid, if they get in speed skating, the coaches said that they were going to make the NHL. And you just find yourself in this place of one-upmanship. And it isn't even that you intended to, and I don't know how it happens, but we find ourselves not even intentionally doing this, but saying things, and then you kind of walk away and you're like, ugh, yuck. That doesn't feel good. Because you'll never be as whatever as them. And you can fill in the blank. You'll never be as smart as them. You'll never be as rich as them. You'll never be as kind as them. You'll never be as good of a singer as them. You'll never be as good of a bass player as them. You'll never be as good as whatever it is. You can fill in the blank with the thing. Maybe it's work. And you've been comparing yourself to somebody else, and you're like, I'm just never going to be as whatever as them at work. And so you secretly, and I know this is ugly, but some of you, I know it's true, some of you feel at times as though you're happy when they fail. That person that's got the promotion that actually it didn't work out well for, and you're like, see, I told you. Told you I deserved that, not them. Yeah. Or you get in that place and you're feeling like you're just not going to be as good as them. And we find ourselves in the comparison trap. We find ourselves in this really ugly place where we're looking to the left and we're feeling inferior to some people. And we're looking to the right and we're feeling superior to others. And if you remember nothing else from the message this morning, if you fall asleep because you worked all night, this is what I want you to remember. Envy rots the bones. There's no win in comparison, as Andy Stanley says it. There's no win. There's no finish line that somehow you arrive and now you feel good about yourself. You now feel like, hey, I'm fine. I don't have to do this anymore. The moment that envy grips your bones, you're going to constantly struggle with this if you don't release it. There is no win in comparison. There's no place, there's no finish line, there's no looking to the left and all of a sudden feeling like one day you've arrived. When we compare, life becomes like a carnival mirror where we feel taller in front of some people and shorter in front of others. But God calls us to use anyone else as a measuring stick of success. He never calls us to do that. Matthew 25, 14 to 30, the parable of the talents, where Jesus gives a sum of money to one person and then a sum of money to another person. God will never hold you accountable for what he has entrusted you with, not what he's entrusted to someone else. He's never going to say, hey, Chris, how come you didn't live Roger's life for him? Hey, Sage, how come you didn't live Dave's life for him? How come you didn't maximize Dave's potential? How come, Kathy, you didn't get Steve to be funnier? Be content with how God made you, what God gave you, where God put you, and then celebrate what God will do with you. Contentment is winning. Contentment is winning. Finding that place of true joy and contentment, regardless of your circumstances, is going to allow you to win. The cure for envy is being content with what God has entrusted us with and using it for his glory. This morning we're going to look at 1 Samuel 17, verses 17 to 40. If you have a Bible or you want to open your phone to that passage, we're going to go through this. It'll be on the screen this morning. But this is an epic battle. This is the scene where David begins to come to glory. King David in the Old Testament, he comes to this battle scene, this epic scene, but he is the youngest of 8 kids of Jesse. David is the smallest, the tiniest, the most insignificant. He's the one they leave behind in the fields to take care of the job that nobody else wants to do. Eliab, his oldest brother, is in charge of armies on the battlefield. But David isn't even invited to the battlefield. He's left at home to take care of the sheep, the dumb sheep that nobody else wants to take care of. And this is the scene. David is wanting to get to the battlefield because he wants to be more significant. He wants to have a purpose. He wants to do something. And the rest of his brothers have ensured that this isn't going to happen. They've left him behind. And it's really, if you've seen the movie Braveheart, anyone?
Yeah.
All right, a few of you. There's this scene where the Scottish are feeling outnumbered by Longshanks' English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And William Wallace rides in on a horse and delivers that they will never take our freedom speech. I don't know if you can picture it in your mind, but there's just a giant army that actually shakes the ground as the horses and cavalry are coming in. And the Scottish are sitting on the other side, and they're a tiny little force. And they feel terrified, and they're saying things like, "We'll never beat them. We have no chance. We're all going to die." And they have things like pitchforks, and the other group have giant swords and spears and just heavy cavalry, and they're kind of thinking, we're just all going to die. And this is how the Israelites are feeling in this moment. They've come into battle against the enemy, there's a giant force before them. In fact, there's one particular giant named Goliath who is there, who is calling them out. So Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. Just, how are you guys? Just wanted to check in to see if I could, do anything. Little brother kind of stuff. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. The Israelites fell into the comparison trap. Goliath is this giant, apparently hairy man, and the Israelites are small and insignificant. They're feeling tiny. They're feeling tiny in comparison. And David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" See, there's a difference. The rest of the army is focused on the giant problem in front of them, who is Goliath, and David is focused on his giant God, this uncircumcised Philistine. This one who doesn't belong to God. This one who isn't amongst the people of God. The one who doesn't have the Spirit of God in him. How dare he defy God's army? David had a very different view. His view wasn't that he was a giant, but that God was. And that Goliath could be defeated by God. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him. I wish my older brother was here this morning because I could just roast him a little bit. And he said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom do you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You come down only to watch the battle, as only a brother can do." David's brother wanted to belittle him because David is kind of calling them all chicken. He's like, "What's wrong with all of you? You giant army with your battle gear on. What's wrong with all of you?" The little brother comes up. And he didn't want his brother to show him up. "Know what I have done," said David. "Can I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and these men answered him as before. When David said, was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him, the king. And David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Now remember, David's just a little guy. We all think of David as just some ripped warrior, but he's the little guy. He's the small and insignificant brother that everybody kept overlooking. And so we got to reimagine what he looks like. Picture scrawny, not much muscle. That's David. Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth. Don't you see the comparison? Don't you see how more bigger and stronger and taller and whatever, more experienced he is?" But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Notice what David says here. The Lord who rescued me. Not, look what I did. But the Lord who rescued me. God has proven himself to David. He's proven himself over and over again as David has stepped out and believed that God was going to come through. And David knew that God was capable of it through him if he allowed him, if he believed for it. Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. Tiny little kid, giant armor on, walking around, looking goofy, can't carry it, it's far too heavy. But how often do we feel like if we just had what someone else had, then we'd be able to accomplish blank? Here's David thinking, "Oh, if I just take on Saul's armor, now I'll be able to do it." He's losing sight of God in that moment. He's becoming dependent on himself, on the things that we add to ourselves, that somehow that's going to make the difference. "I cannot go in these," David said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off, and he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. And you know the rest of the story. He defeated Goliath. David was content with who God made David to be. What God had given David, a sling and a stick. And where God had placed David, he was okay with it. He was content. David was content with God and God's choices for him. This is what God wants for us in the land of Ur. In a culture that's constantly comparing, that's constantly causing us to look to the left and look to the right and feel superior or inferior to others, God is inviting us to be content with who he's made us to be, with the gifts that he's given us, with the call of God on our lives, and to fulfill what he's called us to do. Be content with how God made you, what God gave you, where God put you, and then celebrate what God will do with you. This morning, we had a testimony of a young man who's come into his own and is content with who God is in him. And he could stand up here today to share that with us. May that continue through his life. And may we experience more and more of that in ours.